Here's a quiet Sunday morning on a New York subway. Not much happening. A few tired commuters, the soft rattle of the train. Then a man gets on with his children, and within seconds everything changes. The kids are loud. They're running up and down the aisle, grabbing at newspapers, shouting. One of them nearly knocks over an older woman's bag. And the father, he just sits there, eyes closed, doing absolutely nothing. People start exchanging glances. You know the look, that mix of irritation and disbelief. How can a grown man just sit there while his children turn a subway car into a playground? Eventually, someone can't take it anymore. He turns to the father and says, a little sharper than he probably intended, "Sir, your children are disturbing a lot of people. Could you control them a little more?" The man opens his eyes as if surfacing from somewhere far away. "Oh, you're right," he says quietly. "I guess I should do something about it." And then he says the sentence that changes everything. "We just came from the hospital where their mother died about an hour ago. I don't know what to think, and I guess they don't know how to handle it either." Take a second and just sit with that. Nothing physically changed. The kids are still loud. The subway car is still chaotic. But everything else, the way you feel, the way you see this man, the story running in your head about who he is, it all flips instantly. Irritation turns into compassion. Judgment turns into empathy. In one sentence, you go from thinking, "What a careless father," to thinking, "How is this man even standing right now?" This story is one of the most quoted moments from a book that has sold over 25 million copies and changed how millions of people think about success, relationships, and their own minds. And the reason this tiny subway moment matters so much is because it exposes something uncomfortable about how we actually operate. We don't see the world as it is. We see it through a lens, a private, invisible lens built from our past, our assumptions, our mood that day. And most of the time, we don't even know the lens is there. We just think we're seeing reality. Stephen Covey, the author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, calls that lens a paradigm. And here, the unsettling part, almost every fight you've ever had, every misunderstanding, every moment you judged someone too quickly, happened because two people were looking at the exact same situation through two completely different lenses, and both of them were absolutely certain they were seeing the truth. But this book isn't really about subway trains or perception tricks. It's about something much bigger and much more personal. It's about why so many people who look successful on paper, good job, nice house, decent marriage, still feel this quiet, nagging emptiness, an itch they can't quite scratch. Covey spent years studying 2 centuries of writing on success, trying to figure out why that emptiness exists. And what he found split all of that writing into 2 very different camps. For the first 150 years or so, success literature focused on character, integrity, humility, courage, fairness, the old-fashioned stuff, the belief that who you are on the inside eventually determines what happens on the outside. But after World War I, something shifted. Success advice started focusing on personality instead, your image, your technique, the impression you make in the first 30 seconds of a meeting, how to smile, how to network, how to win people over. Covey doesn't dismiss those skills entirely, but he makes a claim that should make anyone chasing quick fixes a little nervous. Techniques without character are just sophisticated ways of manipulating people, and eventually, people can tell. There's a quote he uses that lands like a gut punch once you actually think about it. Emerson wrote, "What you are shouts so loudly in my ears I cannot hear what you say." Think about the people in your own life who make you feel instantly comfortable, instantly safe, instantly at ease, and now think about the people who say all the right words but somehow still make your skin crawl a little. You can't quite explain why. You just feel it. That's the difference between character and performance. And no technique, no matter how polished, papers over that gap for long. So if character is the real foundation, how do you actually build it? Not as an abstract virtue, but as something practical, something you can act on this week. That's where the paradigm idea becomes useful again, because before you can change your character, you have to notice the lens you're looking through. And once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. Picture someone handing you a map. It says Chicago at the top. You study it carefully, follow every street, use it exactly as intended, except the map is actually of Detroit. No amount of effort, no amount of positive thinking, no amount of hustle is going to get you to the right destination, because the problem was never your effort. It was your map. Covey's point is blunt. A lot of us are working incredibly hard, with great attitudes, following maps that were handed to us by our upbringing, our fears, our old wounds, and we never even ask whether the map is accurate. This isn't just a cute analogy. It's the entire foundation the rest of the book is built on, and it leads to one of the boldest claims in the whole thing. Real, lasting change never comes from adjusting your behavior on the surface. It comes from the inside out. Fix the paradigm first. The behavior follows. Which brings us to the actual architecture of this book, because Covey doesn't just throw 7 random tips at you. He built something closer to a staircase. 7 steps that only work in order because each one depends on the one before it. He starts with a simple but brutal metaphor. A farmer has a goose that lays a golden egg every single day. He gets a little richer each morning, but greed creeps in. Why wait for 1 egg a day, he thinks, when I could just cut the goose open and get them all at once? So he does. And inside he finds nothing. No eggs. Just a dead goose and a future he just destroyed for a shortcut that never existed. That single fable captures something almost every burned-out, overextended person eventually learns the hard way. There's production, the golden eggs, the results you want. And there's production capability, the goose, the actual asset that makes those results possible in the first place. Your health, your relationships, your skills, your trust with others. Chase the eggs while ignoring the goose, and you will get short-term wins and long-term collapse. It happens with a body that gets pushed past exhaustion. It happens with a marriage where one partner keeps producing, favors, and forgets to actually nurture the relationship itself. It happens in businesses that cut quality to boost this quarter's profits and lose customers forever. The goose always keeps score, even when you're not paying attention. And this is exactly why Covey insists the habits have to unfold in a particular sequence. You cannot skip to getting along better with other people if you haven't first done the deeper work on yourself. He calls the first 3 habits the private victory, mastering yourself, moving from depending on others to standing on your own. Only after that can you move into the next 3, the public victory, working powerfully with other people. Skipping ahead is like trying to harvest a crop you never planted. So where does the staircase actually begin? It begins with a discovery made in one of the darkest places a human being has ever been forced to survive. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps during World War II. His family was gone. His freedom was gone. His body was starved, tortured, stripped of every ounce of dignity a person is normally allowed to keep. The guards controlled everything: where he slept, what he ate, whether he lived through the next day. Everything, that is, except one single thing they could never touch. Alone, naked, and utterly powerless, Frankl noticed something happening inside himself that no one could take away: a space, a gap between what was happening to him and how he chose to respond to it internally. His body was a prisoner. His mind, in that narrow gap, was not. He called it the last of the human freedoms, the freedom to choose your attitude and your response, no matter what is being done to you. And astonishingly, he used that freedom not just to survive, but to become a source of strength for other prisoners, and on occasion, even for the men guarding him. This is the seed of the very first habit: be proactive. And it is so much bigger than the corporate buzzword "take initiative" that people usually mistake it for. It means recognizing that between whatever happens to you and however you react, there is a gap, and inside that gap lives your freedom. Reactive people talk like weather vanes spun by outside forces. He makes me so angry. There's nothing I can do. That's just how I am. Proactive people talk differently. I choose how I respond. Let's look at what we can actually do. It sounds like a small shift in vocabulary. It is actually a complete transfer of power back into your own hands. Covey tells the story of a nurse in Sacramento, caring for a patient who was miserable, ungrateful, constantly cruel to her. For a long time, she was convinced this patient was making her miserable. Then, in a moment of clarity, she realized something that flipped her entire world. She was choosing to let this man's misery become her misery, and she could choose otherwise. She described the realization like being let out of prison. "I am free," she said. Nothing about the patient had changed. Everything about her had. This is the deeper truth beneath proactivity, and it leads directly to one of the most practical tools in the entire book. A way of sorting your own worries so you stop wasting your life on things you can't touch. Picture two circles. The outer one is your circle of concern, everything you care about, worry about, complain about. Politics, the economy, other people's opinions, things that happened years ago that you still replay at 2 a.m. The inner circle is your circle of influence, the smaller set of things you can actually do something about. Reactive people live almost entirely in the outer circle. They spend their energy on blame, on outrage, on things utterly outside their control, and the strange, painful irony is that this actually shrinks their influence over time. Proactive people do the opposite. They pour their energy into that smaller inner circle, and something remarkable happens. The circle grows. There's a story of an executive working under a genuinely dictatorial company president, the kind of boss who treated every employee like a disposable errand runner. Most of the staff spent their days complaining about him in the break room, venting about how unfair it all was. One executive, though, did something different. Instead of venting, he studied what the president actually needed. He anticipated problems before they happened. He quietly filled gaps no one else noticed. Over time, without ever raising his voice or demanding recognition, he became someone the president couldn't function without. His circle of influence, once tiny, eventually stretched over the entire operation. You see the same principle on a historical scale with Gandhi. While his critics stood in legislative chambers loudly condemning the British Empire, venting in the circle of concern, Gandhi went and quietly built relationships with field laborers, one person at a time, inside his circle of influence. It looked small, it looked slow, and it eventually brought an empire to its knees. There's something almost unfair about how simple this idea is, and how rarely we actually live by it. Complaining about your circle of concern feels like doing something. It is. Working inside your circle of influence, quietly and consistently, is the only thing that has ever actually moved the needle in anyone's life. Once you've claimed this freedom to choose your response, a new question shows up, and it's a much bigger one. Choose your response toward what exactly? If you're free to build your life in any direction, which direction are you actually building toward? Covey has a way of forcing this question that is, frankly, a little unsettling. He asks you to imagine your own funeral, 3 years from now. You're looking down at the room. 4 people are about to speak, a family member, a friend, a colleague, someone from your community. What do you want each of them to say about the person you actually were? Not the resume, not the achievements, the character, the way you made people feel. The kind of husband, wife, parent, friend you actually turned out to be. It's uncomfortable precisely because it's honest. Most of us are so busy climbing that we never stop to ask which wall the ladder is leaning against. Covey draws a sharp line here between leadership and management. Management is doing things efficiently, climbing the ladder faster. Leadership is deciding which ladder to climb in the first place. And no amount of management brilliance saves you if the leadership decision underneath it was wrong. You can be the most productive person in the building and still be efficiently building the wrong life. This is the essence of the second habit. Begin with the end in mind. Everything, Covey argues, gets created twice, first as a thought, an intention, a mental blueprint, and only afterward as a physical reality. If you don't consciously design that first, mental version of your life, other people and circumstances will design it for you by default. Your job title, your parents' expectations, your culture's definition of success, all of it quietly filling in the blank you never claimed for yourself. The tool for reclaiming that blank space is what Covey calls a personal mission statement, essentially a personal constitution, a description of who you want to be and what you want to contribute, written by you, for you, so that when the winds of daily life try to push you around, you have a changeless core to stand on. And if you think it's too late to rewrite the story you were handed, consider Anwar Sadat. He was raised, from childhood, inside a script of pure hostility toward Israel. Never, never, never was the phrase drilled into him. Later, in a prison cell 54, stripped of freedom just like Frankel, he did something unusual with the isolation. Instead of hardening his hatred, he examined it. He looked at the script he'd inherited and piece by piece questioned it. He rewrote it. And years later, this same man walked into the Israeli parliament and helped launch a peace process that changed the course of history for millions of people who never even knew his name. He put it simply, he who cannot change the very fabric of his thought will never be able to change reality. The script you were handed is not a life sentence. You can rewrite it, but only if you decide, deliberately, what the new version should say, which is exactly what Habit 2 asks you to do. Now here's the part where good intentions usually die. You know what you value. You've maybe even written it down. And then Tuesday happens, email, deadlines, 100 small emergencies, and the mission statement gathers dust in a drawer while your actual life gets decided by whatever screams the loudest. This is where the third habit steps in, and it starts with a question that sounds almost too simple. What actually deserves your time? Covey sorts every task you'll ever face into 4 boxes based on 2 questions: is it urgent and is it important? Quadrant 1 is urgent and important, the crisis, the deadline, the emergency. Quadrant 3 is urgent but not important, the ringing phone, the quick meeting that eats your afternoon. It feels pressing, but it isn't actually moving your life anywhere. Quadrant 4 is neither urgent nor important, pure time wasting. And then there's Quadrant 2, important but not urgent, exercise, relationship building, planning, reading, prevention. Nothing in Quadrant 2 is screaming at you today. Nothing in it feels urgent. And that is exactly why almost everyone neglects it right up until it quietly becomes a crisis of its own. There's a striking real-world example of what happens when people finally shift toward Quadrant 2. A group of shopping center managers realized they were spending less than 5% of their time actually building relationships with the tenants who paid rent in their buildings, the single highest leverage thing they could be doing. They were consumed instead by daily emergencies. Once they deliberately shifted roughly a third of their time toward those tenant relationships, training them, listening to them, genuinely helping them succeed, lease revenue jumped and the crises that used to eat their days simply started disappearing. It sounds almost too simple to be true. Invest in Quadrant 2, and Quadrant 1 shrinks on its own. But the most unforgettable illustration of Habit 3 isn't a business case study at all. It's a father and a 7-year-old boy and a lawn. Covey wanted to teach his young son, Stephen, to take care of the family yard, to keep it, in their words, green and clean. Instead of nagging him or doing it himself, he spent 2 full weeks training the boy on what a healthy, well-kept lawn actually looked like. Then he handed over real ownership. Stephen would be his own boss. His father would only step in if specifically asked to help, and the boy himself would be the judge of whether the job was done well. For days nothing happened. The grass grew ragged, the trash sat where it fell, and then one afternoon the boy broke down crying. "It's so hard, Dad," he said, overwhelmed by a responsibility that was suddenly completely his own. Covey, keeping his word, offered to help, not to take over, just to help, exactly as they'd agreed. And something shifted in that moment. The boy didn't just tolerate the job after that. He started actually caring for that yard consistently, proudly, better than his father ever had. Not because he was forced to, because somewhere in that struggle he'd signed the agreement in his own heart. This is what Covey calls stewardship delegation, handing someone real results and real trust, instead of micromanaging every method along the way. And it isn't just a parenting trick. It's the same principle that separates managers who burn out running everything themselves from leaders who multiply what's possible by trusting the right people with real ownership. By now, you've mastered yourself, or at least you're building the muscle for it, which raises the next, bigger question. What happens when your effectiveness suddenly depends on someone else entirely? A spouse, a business partner, a difficult coworker who sees the world in a way that drives you a little crazy. This is where the book pivots, and the pivot itself carries a warning most people ignore. You cannot fake your way into good relationships. Covey puts it bluntly. You can't talk your way out of problems you behaved yourself into. All the charm, all the clever phrases in the world cannot substitute for actual trustworthiness. And the way he measures that trustworthiness is through something he calls the emotional bank account. Think of every relationship in your life as an actual bank balance. Every act of kindness, every kept promise, every small courtesy, that's a deposit. Every broken promise, every moment of disrespect, every time you talk badly about someone behind their back, that's a withdrawal. When the account is full, communication is effortless. People give you the benefit of the doubt, forgive your mistakes quickly, assume good intent. When the account is overdrawn, every single interaction feels like walking through a minefield. The exact same sentence lands completely differently depending on the balance sitting underneath it. Covey tells a small, almost throwaway story that somehow captures this better than any lecture could. A friend of his had zero interest in baseball, but for years he took his son to see every single major league team play, one stadium at a time. Someone eventually asked him, "Do you like baseball that much?" His answer, "No, but I like my son that much." That's a deposit, not a grand gesture, just quietly making what matters to someone else matter to you too. And then there's a smaller, quieter moment that hits even harder. Covey once carried his sleeping 4-year-old son from a movie theater to the car and laid his own coat over the boy to keep him warm. Nothing planned, nothing performative. Later, his older son, 6 years old, watched all this happen and asked, almost shyly, "Daddy, if I were cold, would you put your coat around me too?" Sit with that question for a second, because it says everything about how relationships actually work. Trust isn't built in the big dramatic gestures we imagine when we picture making things up to someone. It's built, or slowly drained, in 1,000 tiny moments nobody's keeping score of except, apparently, everybody is. Once you understand how fragile and how buildable trust actually is, you're finally ready for the habit that most people misunderstand the most, because it sounds soft, and it is. Think win-win gets mistaken constantly for being agreeable, for compromising, for being the nice one in the room. Covey flatly rejects that reading. He describes a company president who genuinely believed he was practicing win-win in a lease negotiation. He went in open, reasonable, flexible, and walked out having been completely taken advantage of. That wasn't win-win. That was lose-win, and lose-win over time breeds resentment that eventually poisons the relationship anyway. Real win-win requires both the courage to state exactly what you need and the consideration to genuinely care what the other person needs at the same time. Covey calls it twice as tough as simple win-lose competition because it demands far more character, not less. There's a vivid, almost comic illustration of how easily organizations sabotage this without realizing it. A company president wanted his managers to cooperate, he said so constantly. But hanging in the office was a literal chart shaped like a horse race, with each manager's face on a different horse, competing for a single prize, one trip to Bermuda. He was rewarding cutthroat competition while begging, out loud, for teamwork. As Covey puts it, you simply cannot harvest the fruits of cooperation from a system planted with the seeds of competition. If you want people to think win-win, the reward system has to actually reward it. Otherwise, all the motivational speeches in the world are just noise. And sometimes, choosing not to make a deal at all is the most powerful form of win-win there is. A software company had a signed $84,000 contract with a bank. Before the money changed hands, A new bank president came in and seemed uneasy about the deal. Rather than pressure him into an agreement he clearly wasn't comfortable with, the software company simply handed the contract back, walked away from tens of thousands of dollars that were, on paper, already theirs. It looked at the time like financial self-sabotage. 3 months later, that same bank came back and signed a new contract, worth $240,000. Trust, it turns out, compounds. Short-term losses built on integrity have a strange way of turning into long-term gains built on something a lot sturdier than a signature. But before any of that trust can even form, there's a skill underneath it that most of us think we already have, and mostly don't. Picture going to the optometrist with blurry vision. Instead of examining your eyes, he just takes off his own glasses, hands them to you, and says, "Here, try these. I've worn them for 10 years and they've worked great for me." You'd think he was insane. And yet, Covey points out this is precisely what we do to each other constantly, prescribing advice, opinions, solutions, before we've actually diagnosed the problem. We listen, but not really. We listen the way most people listen, waiting for our turn to talk, mentally drafting our reply while the other person is still mid-sentence. He calls the fix seek first to understand, and it's built on something called empathic listening, not agreeing with someone, not sympathizing with them, but genuinely stepping inside their frame of reference and seeing the world exactly as they see it, even if you'd never see it that way yourself. It's harder than it sounds because doing it well requires resisting 4 almost automatic habits: evaluating what they say, probing with your own questions, jumping in with advice, or interpreting their motives through your own filter. All 4 feel helpful in the moment. All 4 are actually about you, not them. There's a small story that captures the cost of skipping this step. Covey's newborn daughter, Jenny, only 2 months old, got sick, and the on-call doctor, paged away from a football game, phoned in a prescription without ever being told her age. Something felt wrong, so Covey called back to clarify. The moment the doctor understood she was a newborn, he changed the prescription immediately. "If you don't have confidence in the diagnosis," Covey later wrote, "you won't have much confidence in the prescription." That line applies just as much to a boardroom disagreement as it does to a pharmacy. And there's a bigger story that shows exactly how much is on the table when this skill is used well. A real estate agent was about to lose a deal he'd worked on for 6 months, right at the finish line. Instead of pitching harder, he tried something almost radical. He simply said to the client, "Let me see if I really understand your position and your concerns." And he listened, really listened. The client, sensing for the first time that someone actually understood what he needed instead of what he was being sold, opened up completely. He stood up, called his wife, and said, "You've got the deal." Understanding, it turns out, closes more deals than persuasion ever could. Once 2 people actually feel understood by each other, not just tolerated, not just negotiated with, but understood, something becomes possible that neither compromise nor persuasion can ever produce on its own. There's a husband who's been planning a fishing trip for months. There's a wife whose mother is seriously ill and needs her nearby. On the surface, this looks like a classic lose-lose standoff. Someone has to give something up. The easy move is compromise. Cancel the trip or shorten the visit, both people a little disappointed, both people a little resentful. But because this couple has built real trust and genuinely understands each other's deeper needs, they don't settle for splitting the difference. They talk it through until something new emerges that neither of them had thought of alone: camping near the mother's home. So he still gets his time outdoors, and she's still right there for her mom. Nobody loses. Nobody merely tolerates a lesser version of what they wanted. They created something better than either original plan. Covey calls this synergize, and the math behind it is deceptively simple. 1 + 1 doesn't have to equal 2, or even the 1½ of compromise. Done right, it equals 8 or 16 or more. The secret ingredient isn't cleverness. It's genuinely valuing the fact that the other person sees things differently than you do, instead of quietly wishing they just agree with you already. As Covey puts it, If two people have the exact same opinion, one of them is unnecessary. Disagreement isn't the obstacle to a better solution. Often, it's the raw material for one. So you've mastered yourself. You've built trust with others. You've learned to create solutions neither side saw coming. There's one habit left, and it's the one almost everyone quietly ignores, right up until their body or their relationships force the issue. A man is out in the woods sawing furiously at a tree for hours. He's exhausted, drenched in sweat, barely making progress. A passerby watches for a while and finally asks, "Why don't you take a break and sharpen that saw? It'd go a lot faster." The man, without even looking up, snaps back, "I don't have time. I'm too busy sawing." That in one small scene is most of adult life. We keep sawing with a dull blade because stopping to sharpen it feels like wasted time, right up until we're burned out, resentful, or sick. And the efficient choice turns out to have been the slowest one all along. Habit 7, sharpen the saw, asks you to protect 4 dimensions of yourself the same way you protect the tools of your trade. The physical, through rest, nutrition, and exercise. The spiritual, through whatever connects you to your deepest values. Quiet reflection, meditation, time in nature, whatever that means for you. The mental, through reading, writing, and genuinely continuing to learn instead of coasting on what you already know. And the social and emotional, through the very relationships we've been talking about this whole time. Covey's prescription is almost absurdly modest given how much it changes. Roughly 1 hour a day, invested in renewing the physical, spiritual, and mental sides of yourself. He calls it the daily private victory, and the argument for it isn't indulgence. It's leverage. You are the one instrument behind every single thing you produce in your life, every relationship, every piece of work, every decision. Neglect the instrument, and eventually everything downstream of it starts to sound a little out of tune. There's one more piece of the story worth knowing, because it shows what all 7 habits are actually for, once you strip away the frameworks and the diagrams. For years, Covey couldn't understand his wife Sandra's strange, almost stubborn insistence on buying only one specific brand of kitchen appliances, Frigidaire, always Frigidaire no matter what. It irritated him. It seemed completely irrational. Then, through the kind of deep, patient conversation the later habits are built to make possible, the real story surfaced. Years earlier, Sandra's father, a man she deeply loved, had been on the edge of financial ruin. A Frigidaire representative extended him financing on inventory when almost no one else would, and that single act of trust saved his business. Sandra wasn't talking about refrigerators. She was talking about loyalty to the man who raised her, and about a debt of gratitude that had nothing to do with kitchen appliances at all. The moment Covey understood that, his irritation dissolved into something closer to reverence. Even the smallest, most irrational-seeming disagreements, he realized, are often rooted in something deeply personal that has nothing to do with the surface argument. Trample on it carelessly, and you're not really arguing about a fridge. You're trampling on sacred ground. That's really the whole book, distilled into one moment between 2 people who loved each other enough to keep asking, why, until they found the real answer underneath. Covey's final, larger idea is this: none of us are stuck simply repeating whatever patterns were handed down to us. You can become what he calls a transition person, someone who takes whatever negative script they inherited, examines it honestly, and chooses not to pass it forward. He puts it simply: there are really only 2 lasting things we can give the people who come after us. One is roots, the other is wings. Everything in this book, the subway story, the goose and the golden egg, the boy crying over his father's lawn, the couple who turned a fishing trip into something better than either of them planned, all of it points back to the same quiet, almost inconvenient truth. You cannot fix your outside world by rearranging the furniture on the surface. You have to start with the paradigm underneath, with the character underneath, with the choice made over and over, in that narrow gap between what happens to you and what you decide to do about it. We covered a lot of ground here, but there are stories in the original book we didn't even have time to touch. The way Covey, rebuilt an entire management training program around trust instead of control. The retreat where a group of executives learned to turn heated disagreement into genuinely creative solutions. The quiet daily rides through the cane fields where he and Sandra learned to actually hear each other. If any of this resonated with you, the book itself is worth sitting with slowly, not as a checklist to finish in a weekend, but as something closer to a companion you return to for years, because a single hour of it, applied honestly, tends to be worth a great deal more than a fast read of the whole thing. So here's the only question worth carrying out of this video with you. Somewhere in your life right now, there's a gap, a small space between something that happened to you and what you're about to do next. What are you going to put in that space? Because whatever you choose there, more than any circumstance, more than any other person, more than anything that's ever happened to you before, that choice is what your life is actually going to be made of.